The winter wind cut through Rebecca Hayes like a blade as she clutched her 6-year-old daughter Emma closer to her chest. The church steps were slick with ice, and the wooden doors had been locked for hours. Pastor Wright had already turned them away twice this week, his congregation's charity fund depleted by the harsh Colorado winter of 1885. Rebecca's thin shawl provided little protection against the bitter cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma's lips had turned blue, and her small body shivered uncontrollably despite the moth-eaten blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The little girl hadn't complained once during their 3-day journey from Kansas, even when Rebecca had to trade their last silver dollar for a loaf of stale bread. Even when they'd slept in the abandoned barn outside Millfield, listening to coyotes howl in the distance, while Rebecca prayed desperately for morning to come. The sound of horse hooves on frozen ground made Rebecca look up from where she huddled against the church door. A large man on horseback approached through the swirling snow, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the gray afternoon sky. His dark coat was well made but practical, the kind worn by men who worked the land rather than those who merely owned it. As he drew closer, Rebecca could see the weariness etched into his weathered face, the kind of exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from carrying burdens too heavy for one man alone. Thomas Mitchell had come to town for supplies, and to place another advertisement in the Millfield Herald. At 35, he'd been searching for a wife for 3 years, ever since his uncle's will had made it clear that the Double M Ranch would pass to the state if Thomas died without an heir. Every woman who'd answered his practical proposals had taken one look at his remote mountain property and decided that city life held more appeal than the isolation of ranch living. He pulled his horse to a stop near the church steps, his attention caught by the desperate scene before him. The woman was young, perhaps mid-20s, with auburn hair that caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds. Her face was pale with cold and exhaustion, but her green eyes held a fierce determination that reminded him of a cornered mountain cat protecting her young. The child in her arms was clearly weakening, her small frame trembling with each gust of wind. Thomas dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. Rebecca tensed, instinctively pulling Emma closer. She'd learned to be wary of strangers, especially men who approached women traveling alone. Too many had offered help that came with prices she couldn't afford to pay. "Ma'am," Thomas said quietly, removing his hat despite the bitter wind. "You and your daughter look like you could use some help." Rebecca's voice was hoarse when she spoke, barely audible above the wind. "We're fine, thank you." The words were automatic, the response of someone who'd learned that admitting weakness often led to exploitation. But even as she spoke, Emma's shivering intensified, and Rebecca knew that pride would be a luxury that might cost her daughter's life. Thomas studied her for a long moment, taking in the carefully mended dress, the shoes worn thin at the soles, the way she held herself with dignity despite circumstances that would have broken many people. This wasn't a woman accustomed to poverty. Something had happened, some tragedy or catastrophe that had stripped away whatever security she'd once known. "Church is closed," he observed, nodding toward the locked doors. "Pastor Wright's gone to Denver for the week. Won't be back until Sunday." Rebecca's heart sank. She'd counted on the church's charity, on finding at least temporary shelter for Emma. The thought of another night in the cold made her stomach clench with fear. Emma couldn't survive much more of this exposure. "There's a storm coming," Thomas continued, his voice matter-of-fact rather than ominous. "Temperature's going to drop another 10 degrees before midnight. That's not weather for traveling with a child." The wind picked up as if to emphasize his point, sending snow swirling around them in violent eddies. Emma whimpered softly against Rebecca's shoulder, and the sound cut through Thomas like a knife. He'd always had a weakness for children, a soft spot that his practical nature couldn't entirely suppress. "I have a proposition," he said suddenly, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. "You look like a woman who's run out of options, and I'm a man with a problem that money can't solve." Rebecca's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She'd heard too many propositions from men, and none of them had been honorable. "What kind of problem?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal to this stranger. But there was something about her desperation that called to his own, something in her eyes that suggested she might understand the weight of impossible choices. "My uncle left me his ranch," he said finally. 10,000 acres of the best grazing land in Colorado. Cattle, horses, a house big enough for a dozen people. But there's a condition in the will. If I die without an heir, everything goes to the territorial government. I've got 2 years to produce a child, or I lose everything my family spent 40 years building. Rebecca stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and she could feel Emma's small body growing heavier against her chest as the cold sapped the child's strength. You need a home, Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was proposing. I need an heir. Seems like we might be able to help each other. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Rebecca's mind raced, weighing options that ranged from impossible to unthinkable. She was a woman alone with a sick child, no money, no family, no prospects. Winter was closing in, and she'd already seen what happened to women in her position. They died quietly in back alleys, or they made compromises that destroyed whatever remained of their souls. You don't know anything about me, she said carefully. I could be anyone, a thief, a murderer, a woman running from the law. Thomas almost smiled at that. Are you? No, the answer came quickly, without hesitation. But you have no way of knowing that. I know you've been sitting on church steps in a blizzard rather than do something desperate, he replied. I know you've kept your daughter alive and fed when most people would have given up. That tells me what I need to know about your character. Emma stirred weakly in Rebecca's arms, her small voice barely a whisper. Mama, I'm so cold. The words broke something inside Rebecca's chest. She looked down at her daughter's pale face, at the shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many hungry nights and too much uncertainty. Whatever happened to Rebecca didn't matter anymore. Only Emma's survival counted. What exactly are you proposing? She asked, her voice stronger now that she'd made her decision. Marriage, Thomas said simply. In name and law, nothing more unless you choose otherwise. You'd have a home, security, protection for your daughter. In return, you'd help me meet the terms of my uncle's will. And after, once you have your heir, then you'd still have a home. The ranch is big enough for all of us. Emma could grow up safe, get an education, have opportunities that most children in these parts never see. Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment settling around her like the falling snow. This man was offering her salvation, but at a price that felt impossibly high. Marriage to us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Stranger, bearing a child for someone she didn't love, didn't even know. Yet what choice did she have? Emma was dying by degrees in her arms, and winter had barely begun. I need to know something about you first, she said, opening her eyes to meet his steady gaze. What kind of man are you? What kind of father would you be? The question seemed to surprise him. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. The wind continued to howl around them, but somehow the space between them felt sheltered, separate from the storm. I'm not a gentle man, he said finally. Ranch life doesn't allow for gentleness, but I'm fair, and I keep my word. I don't drink to excess, don't gamble, don't raise my hand to women or children. As for fatherhood, he paused, his eyes distant. I never thought I'd have children. Lost the woman I was going to marry 5 years ago to influenza. After that, I figured I'd live alone and let the ranch go to the government when I died. But these last few months, thinking about losing everything my uncle built, I've realized that some things are worth fighting for. Rebecca studied his face, searching for signs of deception or cruelty. She'd become skilled at reading men during her desperate journey west, learning to spot the ones who saw her vulnerability as opportunity. But Thomas Mitchell's eyes held only weariness and an unexpected gentleness that he seemed almost embarrassed to reveal. Your daughter, he continued, nodding toward Emma. What's her name? Emma. She's 6. Emma. He repeated the name softly, as if testing how it sounded. She'd be my daughter too, in law if not in blood. I'd treat her as such. See that she's educated, protected, loved. The word loved hung in the air between them, and Rebecca felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't a business transaction anymore. Not entirely. This man was offering not just shelter and security, but the possibility of family, of belonging somewhere again. Why me? She asked. You could advertise in newspapers, find a proper wife from a good family. I've tried that, Thomas admitted. Spent 3 years trying. The kind of women who answer those advertisements want city life, social events, servants, They take one look at mountain ranch life and decide they'd rather remain spinsters. You're different. You understand what it means to fight for survival. Emma stirred again, her breathing shallow and labored. Rebecca knew they were running out of time. The storm was intensifying, and her daughter needed warmth and shelter immediately. If I agree, she said slowly, what happens next? Next we get you and Emma somewhere warm. Then we talk to Pastor Wright when he returns. Make this arrangement legal and proper. After that we go to my ranch and start building whatever kind of life we can manage together. Rebecca looked down at Emma's pale face, then back at the man who was offering them salvation. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of as a young woman, but dreams had died along with her husband 2 years ago. This was about survival now, about giving Emma a chance at a future. All right, she said quietly. I accept your proposition. Thomas nodded once, as if sealing a business deal, rather than arranging a marriage. But Rebecca caught something in his expression that suggested this moment meant more to him than he was willing to admit. There's a boarding house 2 streets over, he said, reaching into his coat for his wallet. Mrs. Patterson keeps clean rooms and serves hot meals. You and Emma can stay there until we can make proper arrangements. I can't pay, Rebecca said, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. You don't need to. We're partners now. Remember, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. He helped her to her feet, his large hands gentle but steady as he supported both her and Emma. The touch was impersonal but kind, the gesture of someone who understood that dignity mattered even in desperate circumstances. As they walked through the snow toward the boarding house, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was real. For the first time since her husband's death, she could imagine a future that didn't involve constant fear and uncertainty. Behind them, the church bells began to toll the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the storm-swept town. The sound seemed to mark the end of one chapter of Rebecca's life and the beginning of another. Whatever came next, she and Emma would face it together, and they would no longer be alone. The boarding house was a modest 2-story building, with yellow light spilling from its windows like beacons in the storm. Mrs. Patterson, a round-faced woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, took one look at Emma's pale face and immediately ushered them inside without asking questions about payment or references. The warmth hit Rebecca like a physical blow, and she nearly wept with relief as feeling began to return to her frozen extremities. Thomas arranged for their room and meals, speaking quietly with Mrs. Patterson while Rebecca held Emma close to the parlor fireplace. The little girl's shivering gradually subsided as warmth seeped back into her small body, and some color returned to her cheeks. For the first time in days, Rebecca allowed herself to relax slightly, to believe that they might actually survive this ordeal. The room's ready, Thomas said, approaching them with a key in his hand. It's upstairs, faces south so it'll catch the morning sun. Mrs. Patterson says she'll bring up some hot soup and fresh bread. Rebecca looked up at him, struck again by the fundamental decency in his actions. He could have taken advantage of her desperation, could have demanded immediate payment for his kindness. Instead, he was treating her with the respect due to an equal partner, rather than a charity case. Thank you, she said simply, knowing the words were inadequate, but meaning them completely. Thank me when we've both gotten what we need, he replied, but his tone was gentle rather than harsh. I'll be staying here tonight as well, different room, of course. Tomorrow we'll talk to Pastor Wright and make this arrangement official. As Rebecca carried Emma upstairs to their room, she found herself wondering what kind of man Thomas Mitchell really was beneath his practical exterior. The room he'd secured for them was clean and comfortable, with a real bed covered in quilts that smelled of lavender and sunshine. A fire had already been lit in the small fireplace, and the windows faced the mountains where his ranch waited in the distance. Emma fell asleep almost immediately after eating the soup. Mrs. Patterson brought up, her small body, finally relaxed and warm for the first time in weeks. Rebecca sat beside the bed, watching her daughter's peaceful face, and trying to process the enormity of what she'd agreed to. In less than 24 hours, she would be married to a man she'd known for less than an hour. She would become the wife of a rancher, the stepmother to children not yet born, the mistress of a house she'd never seen. The fears came then, the questions she'd been too desperate to ask earlier. What if Thomas changed his mind once he learned more about her past? What if he turned out to be cruel or violent, despite his gentle manner? What if she couldn't bear children, couldn't fulfill her part of their bargain? What if Emma couldn't adapt to ranch life, couldn't accept Thomas as a father figure? But even as the worries multiplied in her mind, Rebecca found herself coming back to the same conclusion. Whatever risks lay ahead, they couldn't be worse than the certainty of death that had faced them on those church steps. Thomas Mitchell had offered them a chance at life, at hope, at a future worth living. That was worth almost any risk. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Thomas standing in the hallway, holding a small bundle in his arms. "Mrs. Patterson thought Emma might need these," he said, offering her the package. Inside, Rebecca found a child's nightgown, soft wool stockings, and a small wooden doll with a painted face and yarn hair. "Her own daughter outgrew them years ago," Thomas explained. "She thought your girl might like something of her own." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes at the kindness, at the thoughtfulness of strangers who owed them nothing but chose to give anyway. "Please tell her thank you. Emma will treasure these." Thomas nodded, then hesitated in the doorway, as if there was something else he wanted to say. "Rebecca," he said finally, using her name for the first time, "I want you to know that you can change your mind. Even tomorrow, even after we're married. If you find you can't go through with this arrangement, I'll make sure you and Emma have enough money to start over somewhere else." The offer surprised her, both its generosity and the vulnerability it revealed. This man was giving her an escape route, even as he desperately needed what she could provide. It spoke to a character that valued honor above his own interests. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because desperation makes people agree to things they might not choose otherwise," he replied, quietly. "I don't want a wife who stays with me, only because she has no other choice. That wouldn't be fair to either of us." Rebecca studied his face in the dim hallway light, seeing something there that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "What if I told you that I'm beginning to think this might be the best choice I've ever made?" Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look younger, less burdened. "Then I'd say we might both be luckier than we deserve." After he left, Rebecca sat by the window looking out at the storm-swept town below. Somewhere out there, past the mountains and the snow, was the double-man ranch where she would spend the rest of her life. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Thomas Mitchell, taking on a name and a role she'd never expected to fill. But for the first time since her husband's death, the future held promise instead of just uncertainty. Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something indistinct before settling deeper into the warm quilts. Rebecca reached out to stroke her daughter's hair, marveling at how quickly their circumstances had changed. This morning they'd been homeless and desperate. Tomorrow they would have a family again, different from what they'd lost but potentially just as precious. The wind continued to howl outside, but the room was warm and safe. Rebecca pulled the extra quilt around her shoulders and settled into the chair by the fire, to keep watch over her sleeping daughter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, but tonight they were safe. Tonight they had hope. And sometimes, Rebecca thought as she drifted toward sleep, hope was enough to build a life on. Dawn broke clear and cold over Millfield, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Rebecca woke to sunlight streaming through the frost-covered windows, and the sound of Emma's laughter coming from somewhere downstairs. For a moment she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, trying to orient herself to this new reality. The events of the previous day felt almost dreamlike in their sudden transformation from despair to hope. She dressed quickly in her cleanest dress, a dark blue wool that had seen better days, but was still respectable. Her hands shook slightly as she braided her hair, nerves finally catching up with her, now that she had time to think about what she was about to do. In a few hours, she would be married to a man she barely knew, beginning a life she couldn't quite imagine. Downstairs, she found Emma sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Patterson, helping to knead bread dough with her small hands. The little girl's cheeks were pink with health and excitement, a dramatic change from the pale, frightened child of yesterday. She looked up when Rebecca entered, her face bright with joy. "Mama, look," Mrs. Patterson is teaching me to make bread. And she said Mr. Thomas has horses at his ranch. Real horses that I might get to ride someday. Rebecca's heart clenched at the hope in her daughter's voice. Emma had been through so much loss and uncertainty in her young life. The possibility of stability, of a real home with animals and security, was like a fairy tale to a child who had known too much hardship. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," Rebecca said, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Patterson offered her. The older woman's eyes were kind but knowing, suggesting she understood exactly what kind of arrangement had been made between Rebecca and Thomas. "Mr. Mitchell left early this morning to fetch Pastor Wright back from Denver," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Asked me to tell you he'll return by noon, and that you shouldn't worry about anything being rushed. Said if you need more time to think, he'll understand completely." The consideration touched Rebecca deeply. Even now, Thomas was giving her opportunities to change her mind, to step back from the precipice they were both approaching. But watching Emma's animated chatter about horses and bread making, seeing the color in her daughter's cheeks and the light in her eyes, Rebecca knew her decision was made. Thomas returned just as the church bells chimed 12, accompanied by Pastor Wright, a tall thin man with gentle eyes and prematurely gray hair. The pastor looked somewhat bewildered by the hasty summons back to town, but his expression was kind as Thomas made the introductions. "Mr. Mitchell has explained the circumstances," Pastor Wright said carefully, his eyes moving between Rebecca and Thomas. "I want to make certain that both parties understand the gravity of what they're undertaking. Marriage is a sacred bond, not to be entered into lightly even under extraordinary circumstances." Rebecca appreciated his concern, but she had moved beyond doubt. "I understand, Pastor. We both do. This isn't a conventional courtship, but it's an honest arrangement between two people who need what the other can provide." Thomas nodded his agreement. "We're both adults making a conscious choice. We understand the responsibilities we're taking on." The ceremony took place in the small parlor of the boarding house, with Mrs. Patterson and her husband serving as witnesses. Emma stood close to Rebecca's side, clutching the wooden doll she'd been given the night before. The words were simple and traditional, but Rebecca found herself listening carefully to each promise, each vow, trying to understand what kind of life she was committing herself to. When Pastor Wright pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas took her hand gently and pressed a chaste kiss to her knuckles rather than her lips. The gesture was respectful, acknowledging the practical nature of their union, while still honoring the solemnity of the moment. Rebecca felt a surprising flutter of gratitude for his restraint, for understanding that intimacy would need to grow naturally between them, rather than being demanded by legal right. The marriage certificate was signed and witnessed, making their union official in the eyes of both law and church. As Rebecca wrote her new name for the first time, Rebecca Mitchell, she felt the weight of transformation settling around her like a new garment. She was no longer Rebecca Hayes, desperate widow with no prospects. She was now Mrs. Thomas Mitchell, mistress of the double man, stepmother and future mother. The change felt both thrilling and terrifying. After the ceremony, Thomas helped them gather their few belongings and load them into his wagon. The afternoon was crisp and bright, perfect weather for traveling, and Rebecca found herself eager to see the ranch that would be her new home. Emma chattered excitedly from her place between them on the wagon seat, asking endless questions about the animals they would encounter, and the adventures that awaited. The journey to the ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Rebecca had ever seen. Pine-covered mountains rose on either side of the valley, their peaks still white with snow that caught the afternoon sun like scattered diamonds. The road wound along a clear creek that gurgled and splashed over smooth stones, and they passed meadows where cattle grazed peacefully in the winter sun. Thomas proved to be a patient teacher, pointing out landmarks and explaining the geography of their new home. He told Emma about the different animals they might see, from deer and elk to the occasional bear or mountain lion. Rather than frightening the child, these stories seemed to enchant her,
and Rebecca could see her daughter's imagination already running wild with possibilities. The house sits on a ridge overlooking the main valley, Thomas explained as they climbed a winding road through dense pine forest. My uncle chose the spot for the view and the protection from winter storms. You can see for miles in every direction, and there's a spring that never runs dry even in the driest summers. When they finally crested the ridge and the Double M Ranch came into view, Rebecca caught her breath in amazement. The house was larger than she had expected, a two-story log structure with a wide wraparound porch and stone chimney that spoke of comfort and permanence. Outbuildings dotted the immediate area, including a large barn, several smaller storage buildings, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse for ranch hands. But it was the setting that truly took her breath away. The house commanded a panoramic view of the entire valley, with rolling pastures stretching as far as the eye could see. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and horses moved through a large corral near the barn. Mountains ringed the entire vista, creating a sense of being cradled in the embrace of something ancient and enduring. "It's beautiful," Rebecca said softly, meaning it completely. "I've never seen anything like it." Thomas seemed pleased by her reaction, though he tried to hide it behind his practical manner. "It's good land. Uncle worked 40 years to build this place up from nothing. Started with just a cabin and 20 head of cattle. Now we're running 500 head, and have some of the finest horses in Colorado." Emma was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. "Where are the horses, Mr. Thomas? Can I see them? Can I pet them?" "Soon as we get settled," Thomas promised, and Rebecca was touched by the genuine warmth in his voice when he spoke to her daughter. "But first we need to get you and your mother moved into the house. Mrs. Rodriguez has been keeping it clean, but she's been waiting for a woman's touch to make it feel like home again." As they approached the house, Rebecca could see curious faces peering out from the barn and bunkhouse. The ranch hands were naturally interested in meeting their boss's new wife, and she felt a flutter of nervousness about making a good impression. These men would be part of their daily life, and their acceptance would make the transition much easier. Thomas seemed to understand her concern. "The men are good workers and decent people," he said quietly. "They've been wondering when I'd finally find a wife. They'll be respectful, but don't be surprised if they're a bit curious at first." The house itself was even more impressive inside than out. The main room featured a large stone fireplace with comfortable furniture arranged around it, and tall windows that let in plenty of natural light. The kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, with a large wooden table that could easily seat a dozen people. Rebecca could imagine preparing meals here, hosting gatherings, creating the kind of warm family atmosphere she'd always dreamed of providing for Emma. Mrs. Rodriguez
Lives in town but comes out 3 times a week to help with cleaning and cooking, Thomas explained as he showed them through the house. "She's been managing the household since my uncle's death, but now that you're here, you'll be the mistress of the house. Whatever arrangements you want to make are fine with me." The generosity of the statement struck Rebecca forcefully. Many men would have expected their wives to simply fit into existing arrangements without question. Thomas was offering her genuine authority over her new domain, trusting her judgment about domestic matters even though they barely knew each other. Emma's room was upstairs, with windows facing the mountains and enough space for a child to play and grow. Thomas had clearly given thought to her needs, and Rebecca was touched to see that he'd already placed some books on the small shelf beside the bed. When Emma discovered them, her squeal of delight echoed through the house. "I thought she might like to read," Thomas said, seeming almost embarrassed by the gesture. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned she's smart as a whip. Figured she'd want something to occupy her mind during the long winter evenings." Rebecca's own room was across the hall from Emma's, spacious and comfortable with a view of the valley that would be spectacular at sunrise. Thomas's room was at the far end of the hall, providing privacy and space for both of them to adjust to their new circumstances without feeling crowded or pressured. "I know this is all happening very fast," Thomas said as they stood in her new room. "I want you to know that you're free to arrange things however makes you comfortable. This is your home now, not just a place you're staying." The afternoon was spent in a whirlwind of introductions and explanations. The ranch hands were indeed curious but respectful, tipping their hats to Rebecca and being gentle with Emma's endless questions about ranch life. Jake Morrison, the foreman, was a weathered man in his 50s who'd worked for Thomas's uncle for over 20 years. His acceptance of Rebecca seemed to set the tone for the other men, and she felt some of her nervousness ease. Emma was in heaven exploring her new surroundings. Thomas kept his promise about the horses, introducing her to a gentle mare named Buttercup, who seemed perfectly content to let a small girl pet her nose and feed her sugar cubes. The sight of her daughter laughing and running in the winter sunshine, healthy and happy and safe, made Rebecca's eyes fill with grateful tears. As evening approached, they gathered in the main room around the fireplace. Thomas had built up a crackling fire that filled the room with warmth and dancing light. Emma curled up on the rug with one of her new books, reading aloud in her clear young voice, while Rebecca and Thomas sat in comfortable chairs nearby. "She reads well for her age," Thomas observed, his voice low so as not to disturb the child's concentration. "Her father taught her," Rebecca replied, feeling the familiar pang that came with memories of her late husband. "He believed education was the key to everything. Said no one could take knowledge away from you once you had it. He sounds like a wise man. What happened to him?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment, gathering herself to tell a story she'd shared with very few people. "Accident at the mill where he worked. Heavy machinery fell and crushed his chest. He lived for 3 days after, but the doctors said there was nothing they could do." Thomas's expression was grave and sympathetic. "I'm sorry, that must have been terrible for both of you. The worst part was the debt," Rebecca continued, finding it easier to talk about than she'd expected. "The mill owners claimed negligence, said they weren't responsible for the accident. We'd been saving to buy a little house, but all that money went to doctors and then to burial costs. After that, the bills just kept coming. I sold everything we owned, took in washing and sewing, did everything I could think of, but it was never enough." She paused, watching Emma turn the page of her book with careful fingers. "When they came to evict us from our rooms, I knew we had to leave Kansas. I'd heard there were opportunities out west, jobs for women willing to work hard. But the journey took longer than I expected. Cost more than I'd planned. By the time we reached Colorado, we were down to our last few dollars." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "You've been through hell," he said finally. "Both of you. Takes courage to start over with nothing but hope." "I didn't feel courageous," Rebecca admitted. "I felt desperate and terrified. I was so afraid I was going to fail Emma that I wouldn't be able to keep her safe. But you did keep her safe. You brought her here to a place where she can grow up healthy and happy. That's not failure. That's the kind of success that matters most." The simple affirmation touched something deep in Rebecca's chest. For so long she'd felt like she was failing at everything, barely staying ahead of disaster. To have someone recognize her efforts, acknowledge the victories hidden within apparent defeat, meant more than she could express. Emma's voice gradually grew sleepy as she read, and eventually Thomas suggested it was time for her to get ready for bed. Rebecca tucked her daughter into the comfortable bed in her new room, marveling at how quickly Emma had adapted to these changed circumstances. Children, she reflected, were remarkably resilient when they felt safe and loved. "Mama," Emma said as Rebecca bent to kiss her goodnight. "I like it here. I like Mr. Thomas. He's kind like Papa was." The observation hit Rebecca with unexpected force. Emma had been only 4 when her father died, but she still remembered his gentleness, his way of making her feel precious and protected. For her to see those same qualities in Thomas spoke volumes about the kind of man Rebecca had married. "I'm glad you like it here, sweetheart," Rebecca said softly. "This is our home now. We're going to be happy here." "Are you going to have babies with Mr. Thomas?" Emma asked with the directness that only children could manage. Mrs. Patterson said married people sometimes have babies. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Perhaps someday. Would you like to have a little brother or sister?" Emma considered this seriously. "I think so. It gets lonely being the only child. And Mr. Thomas would be a good papa. I think." After Emma fell asleep, Rebecca returned downstairs to find Thomas banking the fire for the night. The house felt different now, with the lamps turned low and the sounds of settling wood creaking around them. More intimate, more like the home of a married couple rather than strangers sharing space. "She's a remarkable child," Thomas said when Rebecca joined him by the fireplace. "You've done an extraordinary job raising her under difficult circumstances. She's the reason I kept going when everything else fell apart," Rebecca replied. I couldn't let her down. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. The arrangement between them was practical, born of mutual need rather than romance. But Rebecca found herself genuinely grateful for this man's presence in their lives. He had already shown more consideration and kindness than she had dared to hope for. "Thomas," she said finally, using his name deliberately for the first time, "I want you to know that I intend to honor our agreement completely. I understand what you need from this marriage, and I'm prepared to fulfill my part when the time comes." He turned to look at her, his expression serious in the firelight. "I appreciate that, Rebecca. But I want you to know that there's no pressure, no timeline you need to worry about. When and if that part of our relationship develops, it should feel natural to both of us. I'm not going to demand my husbandly rights just because we're legally married." The relief Rebecca felt was profound. She had steeled herself to accept whatever physical demands he might make, but his consideration gave her space to breathe, to let whatever feelings might develop between them grow organically rather than being forced by circumstance. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more to me than you probably realize." As they prepared to go their separate ways for the night, Thomas paused at the bottom of the stairs. "Rebecca, I want you to know that having you and Emma here already feels right. The house has been too quiet for too long. It's good to hear a child's laughter again. Good to have someone to share meals with. Whatever else develops between us, you've already given me something valuable." The words stayed with Rebecca as she prepared for bed in her new room. Looking out at the moonlit valley that was now her home, she felt a cautious optimism beginning to bloom in her chest. This marriage might have been born of desperation and practical need, but perhaps it could become something more. Perhaps, given time and patience, they could build something real and lasting together. As she drifted off to sleep in her comfortable bed, warm and safe for the first time in months, Rebecca allowed herself to imagine a future filled with hope rather than fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and adjustments, but tonight she could rest, knowing that she and Emma had found sanctuary. They were home. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Rebecca with its naturalness. Each morning she woke to the sound of Thomas moving quietly through the house, starting the fire in the kitchen stove and putting coffee on to brew before heading out to tend the animals. She would dress quickly and join him for breakfast, learning the patterns of ranch life while Emma slept peacefully upstairs. These early morning conversations became precious to her, stolen moments of adult companionship before the day's responsibilities claimed them both. Thomas would tell her about the cattle, about weather patterns and seasonal challenges, gradually including her in the decision-making that kept the ranch running smoothly. His respect for her intelligence was evident in the way he sought her opinions, valued her suggestions, treated her as a true partner rather than merely a wife. Fulfilling domestic duties, Rebecca found herself falling into the role of ranch mistress with surprising ease. Her natural organizational skills, honed by years of managing a household on limited resources, proved invaluable in coordinating the complex logistics of feeding and housing the ranch hands, managing supplies, and planning for seasonal needs. Mrs. Rodriguez, initially wary of having her authority usurped, quickly warmed to Rebecca's collaborative approach and became an invaluable ally in understanding the traditions and expectations of ranch life. Emma thrived in ways that made Rebecca's heart sing with gratitude. The little girl who had been pale and frightened just weeks before now ran through the house with rosy cheeks and boundless energy. She had claimed Buttercup as her special horse, and spent hours in the corral under Jake Morrison's watchful eye, learning to brush and care for the gentle mare. Her laughter echoed across the valley like music, bringing smiles to the faces of even the most weathered ranch hands. Thomas proved to be a natural with children, patient and kind without being permissive. He included Emma in his daily rounds when possible, teaching her about animal husbandry and land management with the same seriousness he would show an adult student. Emma absorbed everything like a sponge, her quick mind grasping concepts that impressed even the experienced ranch hands. One evening in late February, Rebecca was preparing dinner when she heard Emma's excited voice calling from the front porch. She looked out to see Thomas returning from a trip to town, but instead of his usual solitary approach, he was leading a second horse with a small figure bundled in winter clothes perched in the saddle. "Mama, look, Mr. Thomas bought me my own horse." Emma's voice carried clearly across the yard,
filled with such pure joy that Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes. The horse was a young Pinta gelding, gentle-eyed and perfectly sized for a child. Thomas had clearly spent considerable time choosing the animal, ensuring it had the right temperament and training for a young rider. As Rebecca watched him help Emma down from the saddle, explaining how to properly care for her new companion, she felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the action of a man fulfilling an obligation to his wife's child. This was the gesture of someone who genuinely cared about Emma's happiness. That night, after Emma had finally been convinced to leave the barn and come inside for dinner, she chattered endlessly about her new horse, whom she had immediately named Patches for his distinctive coloring. Thomas listened with genuine interest, offering advice about riding and care while Rebecca marveled at the easy affection that had developed between them. "Why did you do that?" Rebecca asked later, when Emma had gone to bed and they were sitting by the fire. "Buy her a horse, I mean. It wasn't necessary." Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "She belongs here now," he said finally. "This is her home, her life. Every child on a ranch should have their own horse. It teaches responsibility, builds confidence. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "did you see her face? I haven't seen joy like that in a long time." The simple statement revealed so much about this man she was slowly coming to understand. Thomas Mitchell was not given to grand gestures or flowery speeches, but his actions spoke of deep kindness and genuine care for those under his protection. Emma was not his biological daughter, might never be more than his stepdaughter, but he was already treating her as if she were his own flesh and blood. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Rebecca found herself settling into ranch life with increasing confidence. She took over much of the household management from Mrs. Rodriguez, not out of any desire to assert authority but because she genuinely enjoyed the work. Planning meals for a dozen hungry ranch hands, organizing the spring cleaning, managing the household budget that Thomas had placed entirely in her hands. All of it felt meaningful in a way her previous domestic work never had. The respect of the ranch hands came gradually but genuinely. At first they had been polite but distant, uncertain how to relate to the boss's new wife. But as they saw her competence, her willingness to work alongside them when needed, her fair treatment of everyone regardless of their position, they began to accept her as truly belonging to the Double M family. Jake Morrison proved particularly valuable in helping her understand the social dynamics of ranch life. The weathered foreman had an intuitive understanding of people that complemented his knowledge of cattle and horses. He began including Rebecca in discussions about hiring and personnel decisions, recognizing that her insights into character and motivation were often remarkably accurate. "You've got a good eye for people, Mrs. Mitchell," he told her, one afternoon as they watched a new ranch hand work with the horses. "That's a rare gift, especially out here where you have to trust the men you work with completely." The use of her married name still sent a small thrill through Rebecca. After months of feeling like an outsider everywhere she went, she was beginning to truly belong somewhere. The Double M Ranch wasn't just a place she lived, it was becoming home in the deepest sense of the word. Her relationship with Thomas continued to evolve in ways that surprised them both. Their initial practical arrangement had been based on mutual need and basic compatibility, but something deeper was growing between them. They began to seek each other's company, not just for necessary discussions about ranch business, but for the simple pleasure of conversation. Thomas had a dry sense of humor that emerged gradually as he became more comfortable with her. Rebecca discovered she could make him laugh, something he confessed he hadn't done much of in recent years. Their evening conversations by the fire became the highlight of Rebecca's day, a time when they could share thoughts and observations without the pressure of their unusual circumstances hanging over them. One evening in early March, Thomas returned from a trip to Denver with news that made Rebecca's stomach clench with worry. He had met with his lawyer to review the terms of his uncle's will, and the reality of their situation had been made starkly clear. "I have until September," he said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. "If there's no child on the way by then, the ranch goes to the territorial government." The lawyer was very specific about the timeline. Rebecca felt the weight of obligation settle around her like a heavy cloak. 6 months to conceive a child with a man she was only beginning to know and care for. The practical nature of their arrangement suddenly felt overwhelming. The pressure to perform her part of their bargain both urgent and deeply personal. "I understand," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We knew this day would come." Thomas looked at her then, his expression troubled. "Rebecca, I don't want you to feel pressured. If this doesn't happen naturally between us, if you can't bring yourself to, I'd rather lose the ranch than force you into something you're not ready for." The gentleness in his voice, the genuine concern for her feelings despite what losing the ranch would mean to him, touched something deep in Rebecca's heart. This man was offering to sacrifice everything he'd worked for rather than demand what was legally his right as her husband. The nobility of the gesture made her decision easier rather than harder. "Thomas," she said softly, moving closer to where he sat by the fire, "I need you to know that this arrangement isn't just about obligation anymore. At least not for me. These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing the man you are with Emma, with the ranch hands, with me, I've come to care for you. Genuinely care for you." His eyes searched her face, looking for signs of duty disguised as affection. "You don't have to say that to make this easier." "I'm not saying it to make anything easier," Rebecca replied firmly. "I'm saying it because it's true. What started as a practical arrangement has become something more, at least for me. Has it for you?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the fire and back again. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. "From the first morning I heard Emma's laughter in this house, from the first time I came home to find you waiting with dinner ready and genuine interest in how my day had gone, I knew something had changed. This place feels alive again in a way it hasn't since my uncle died. You've brought warmth and joy and purpose to every corner of this ranch. So yes, Rebecca, it's become something more for me too." The admission hung between them, transforming the nature of their relationship with its honesty. They were no longer strangers bound by practical necessity. They were two people who had found unexpected connection in the midst of desperate circumstances, who had discovered that companionship could grow into something deeper and more meaningful. Rebecca reached out to take his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work, the strength that had become so familiar and comforting to her. "Then we'll face this together, as partners who care for each other rather than strangers fulfilling an obligation." That night, Thomas walked her to her bedroom door as he had every night since their marriage. But this time, instead of the polite good night they usually shared, he paused in the doorway. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "there's no rush. We have time to let this develop naturally between us. I want you to be certain of your feelings, certain of what you want." She looked up at him, this good man who had given her and Emma everything they could have hoped for and more. "I am certain," she said simply. "The question is whether you are." In response, Thomas reached out to cup her face gently in his hands. His touch was warm and careful, the gesture of a man who valued what he held too much to risk damaging it through haste or carelessness. When he bent to kiss her, it was with tenderness rather than passion, a promise of what could develop between them, rather than a demand for immediate consummation of their arrangement. The kiss was soft and sweet, lasting only a moment, but carrying the weight of all the trust and affection that had grown between them over the past weeks. When they separated, Rebecca felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with emotional connection. "Good night, Rebecca," Thomas said softly, his thumb brushing across her cheek before he stepped back. "Good night, Thomas," she replied, her voice carrying a contentment that would have seemed impossible just months before. As Rebecca prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this place. The desperate woman who had sat on church steps in a blizzard, ready to accept any arrangement that would save her daughter's life, was gone. In her place was a woman who had found not just security but genuine happiness, not just shelter but a true home. The weeks that followed brought a subtle but significant change to the dynamic between Rebecca and Thomas. Their evening conversations took on a more intimate quality. Their casual touches became more frequent and lingering. The awareness of their mutual attraction simmered beneath the surface of their daily interactions, adding a new dimension to their partnership without overwhelming the solid foundation of respect and companionship they had built. Emma, with the intuitive perception that children often possess, seemed to sense the growing closeness between her mother and stepfather. Her behavior reflected a security and happiness that warmed Rebecca's heart. The little girl who had once been cautious and fearful now moved through the world with confidence, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected by not one but two adults who would do anything to ensure her well-being. One afternoon, in late March, Rebecca was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the house at speed. The urgency in the hoofbeats made her look up from her work with concern. Through the window, she could see Jake Morrison and two of the other ranch hands riding hard toward the house, their faces grim with some kind of trouble. Thomas emerged from the barn at the same time Rebecca stepped onto the porch, both of them recognizing that something significant was happening. Jake's horse was lathered with sweat, suggesting he had been riding hard for some time. "Boss," Jake called out as he pulled his horse to a stop. "We've got trouble heading this way. Victoria Caldwell is coming up the valley road with at least a dozen men, armed men by the look of them." Rebecca felt her blood run cold at the mention of Victoria Caldwell. Thomas had mentioned the name once or twice in passing, always with a tightness around his eyes that suggested painful history. She was someone from his past, someone connected to the woman he had planned to marry before influenza claimed her life. Thomas's expression darkened, his jaw setting in the hard lines that Rebecca had learned meant he was preparing for conflict. "How far out are they?" "Maybe an hour, hour and a half at most," Jake replied. "Looked like they were taking their time, not trying to surprise us but not exactly coming for a social call either." "What does she want?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. In her experience, trouble usually came in the form of people who believed they had claims on what belonged to others. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities and implications. When he spoke, his voice was grim with the weight of old pain and new worry. "Victoria Caldwell was engaged to my cousin James before he died in the war. She had expectations about inheriting part of this ranch, expectations my uncle's will didn't fulfill. She's been making noise for years about contesting the inheritance, claiming James had promised her certain rights to the land." The pieces began to fall into place for Rebecca. A woman with a legal claim, or at least the belief that she had one, arriving with armed men just as Thomas's marriage had provided him with the possibility of meeting his uncle's conditions. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. "She knows about our marriage," Rebecca said, the certainty settling in her stomach like a stone. "Someone told her about the wedding, about what it means for your inheritance." Thomas nodded grimly. "News travels fast in these parts, especially news that affects property ownership. If Victoria thinks she can contest my claim to the ranch, now would be the time to do it, before you have a chance to produce the heir that would secure my inheritance permanently." The weight of their situation pressed down on Rebecca like a physical force. Their peaceful weeks of building a life together, of falling genuinely in love, were about to be challenged by the ugly realities of greed and legal manipulation. Everything they had built, everything Emma had come to depend on, was suddenly at risk. "What do we do?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady, despite the fear racing through her veins. Thomas looked at her with an expression that mixed determination with something that might have been pride. "We stand our ground. This is our home, our land, our life. Victoria Caldwell can make all the claims she wants, but the law is on our side. The will is clear, and our marriage is legal and legitimate." Jake Morrison spoke up from where he still sat his horse. "Boss, I know Victoria Caldwell from the old days. She's not the type to give up easy, and she's got money behind her now. Married a territorial judge a few years back. Man named Harrison Vale. Word is he's got political ambitions, and isn't too particular about how he achieves them. The name sent a chill through Rebecca. A territorial judge would have significant legal authority. The kind of power that could make their lives very difficult regardless of the technical legitimacy of their position. Victoria Caldwell wasn't just coming with armed men. She was coming with legal backing that could prove even more dangerous than physical threats. Then we'd better be ready for whatever she's planning, Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet determination that Rebecca had come to love. Jake, send word to Pastor Wright in town. I want witnesses to our marriage readily available if questions arise. Also send someone to fetch our lawyer from Denver. If this is going to be a legal fight, we need proper representation. As the ranch hands dispersed to carry out their orders, Thomas turned to Rebecca with an expression that mixed regret with resolve. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I hoped we'd have more time before something like this happened. I wanted you to feel completely secure here before having to deal with challenges to our position. Rebecca reached out to take his hand, drawing strength from the contact even as she offered her own support. We're in this together, remember? Whatever comes, we'll face it as partners. The sound of Emma's laughter drifted across the yard from
where she was playing with Patches in the corral, blissfully unaware of the storm that was approaching. Rebecca's jaw tightened with protective instincts as fierce as any mother bear defending her cubs. She had found happiness and security for her daughter in this place. With this man, she would not let anyone take that away without a fight. As they stood together on the porch, watching the road that would soon bring trouble to their door, Rebecca felt the same determination that had carried her through her husband's death and the desperate journey west. She had survived worse than Victoria Caldwell's threats, and she had more to fight for now than she'd ever had before. The double marriage was her home, Thomas was her husband in truth as well as law, and Emma was finally safe and happy. Those were worth defending with everything she had. Victoria Caldwell arrived at the double marriage like a storm front moving across the valley, her entourage of armed men and legal officials creating an atmosphere of barely contained menace. She sat astride a magnificent black stallion, her riding habit immaculate despite the dusty journey, her bearing that of a woman accustomed to getting her way through a combination of wealth, legal maneuvering, and sheer force of will. Rebecca watched from the porch as the group approached, studying the woman who threatened everything they had built. Victoria was beautiful in the way that money and privilege could create. Her blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the journey, her clothes expensive and expertly tailored. But there was something cold in her blue eyes, a hardness that spoke of someone who viewed other people as obstacles to be overcome rather than individuals deserving of consideration. Beside Victoria rode a man who could only be Judge Harrison Vale, her husband and the source of her legal authority. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the soft look of someone who had lived well on other people's labor. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging the ranch's assets with the calculating gaze of someone already planning their redistribution. Thomas stepped forward as the group reached the house, his posture straight and unyielding. Rebecca moved to stand beside him, presenting a united front despite the fear racing through her veins. Jake Morrison and several of the ranch hands had positioned themselves strategically around the yard, not threatening but ready to respond if the situation escalated beyond words. Victoria, Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. Judge Vale, to what do I owe this unexpected visit? Victoria's smile was as cold as mountain snow. Thomas dear, surely you remember the conversations we had about James's intentions regarding this ranch. Just because your uncle chose to ignore my late fiancé's wishes doesn't mean they cease to have legal standing. Judge Vale urged his horse forward slightly, asserting his authority through position and proximity. Mitchell, I'm here in my official capacity to investigate claims that the current ownership of this property may be invalid. There are questions about your uncle's mental competency when he wrote his will, as well as concerns about recent changes to your marital status that appear suspiciously convenient given the inheritance requirements. Rebecca felt Thomas tense beside her, but his voice remained steady when he replied. My uncle was of sound mind when he wrote his will, as attested by multiple witnesses including Pastor Wright and the territorial attorney who helped draft the document. As for my marriage, it's legal, legitimate, and properly recorded with both civil and religious authorities. A marriage of convenience to a desperate woman with a child, Victoria said, her tone dripping with disdain as her eyes fixed on Rebecca. How touching that you found someone willing to play the role of devoted wife in exchange for shelter and security. I'm sure it's purely coincidental that this arrangement provides you with the opportunity to meet your uncle's rather specific inheritance requirements. The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be believable. Rebecca's initial agreement with Thomas had indeed been based on practical necessity rather than romantic love. But what had grown between them since then was real, genuine, and deeper than anything Victoria's cynical worldview could comprehend. My marriage is none of your concern, Thomas replied, his voice carrying a warning edge. Legal documents speak for themselves. This ranch belongs to me according to my uncle's will, and I'll defend that ownership against any challenge. Judge Vale smiled unpleasantly. Actually, Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Caldwell has brought some interesting information to my attention. It seems there's evidence that your uncle may have made promises to her late fiancé regarding the inheritance of this property. Promises that predate his written will and may therefore take precedence under territorial law. Rebecca's heart sank as she recognized the trap being laid. Even if such promises had never been made, proving their non-existence would be difficult without James alive to testify. Victoria and her husband had clearly spent considerable time crafting a legal challenge that would be hard to refute quickly. What kind of evidence? Thomas demanded. Victoria reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a folded document, handling it with theatrical care. A letter from James to me written just before he left for the war. In it he specifically mentions your uncle's promise that we would inherit the ranch together after our marriage. He even describes plans we made for expanding the cattle operation and building a larger house. The document looked official enough from a distance, complete with what appeared to be aged paper and faded ink. Rebecca suspected it was a forgery, but proving that would require time and expert examination that they might not be able to arrange before legal action could be taken. Judge Vale leaned forward in his saddle. In light of this evidence, I'm prepared to issue a temporary injunction preventing any major decisions regarding this property until a full legal review can be conducted. That would include any changes to the ranch operation, any sales of livestock or equipment, and any actions that might be construed as attempting to meet the inheritance requirements through artificial means. The threat was clear. If they could prevent Thomas from legally establishing his claim through producing an heir, they could drag the legal proceedings out until the inheritance deadline passed. Once that happened, the ranch would revert to territorial control, at which point a judge with political ambitions might find ways to ensure it ended up in the hands of his wife. You can't do that, Rebecca said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. Thomas has legal ownership of this ranch. You can't simply take it away based on a convenient letter that conveniently appears just when the inheritance deadline approaches. Victoria's eyes fixed on Rebecca with obvious contempt. How brave of you to speak up, dear. Though I suppose you have the most to lose here. After all, if Thomas loses the ranch, what happens to your comfortable new life? Back to whatever desperate circumstances drove you to accept such an arrangement in the first place, I imagine. The cruelty in her voice was designed to wound, to make Rebecca feel small and ashamed of her past struggles. But instead of cowering, Rebecca felt anger rise in her chest like a flame catching dry timber. This woman had no idea what real hardship looked like, what it meant to fight for survival with a child's life hanging in the balance. You're right, Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I was desperate when I met Thomas. Desperate enough to sit on church steps in a blizzard with my sick daughter rather than compromise my principles. Desperate enough to accept marriage to a stranger rather than let my child die from cold and hunger. But what we've built here is real, Judge Vale. It's based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared commitment to something bigger than ourselves. She stepped forward, ignoring the armed men who shifted nervously at her movement. You want to talk about convenience? Let's discuss the convenience of Mrs. Caldwell suddenly producing a letter from a man who's been dead for over 20 years, just in time to challenge an inheritance she's had decades to contest. Let's talk about the convenience of a territorial judge taking personal interest in a property dispute involving his wife's claims. Judge Vale's face flushed red with anger. You forget yourself, woman. I am an officer of the territorial court, and I will not be spoken to in such a manner by someone of your station. My station? Rebecca's voice carried a steely edge that reminded Thomas of the courage that had carried her through impossible circumstances. I am Mrs. Thomas Mitchell, mistress of the Double Man Ranch, and you are a guest on my property. A very unwelcome guest who has overstayed any courtesy we might have extended. The silence that followed was tense with potential violence. The armed men Victoria had brought shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to weapons. Jake Morrison and the ranch hands responded by spreading out slightly, making themselves less vulnerable to coordinated attack while maintaining clear fields of fire. Thomas broke the standoff by speaking directly to Judge Vale. You've made your threats clear, Judge. If you intend to pursue legal action, you'll need to do it through proper channels. File your paperwork, present your evidence, and we'll see you in court. But right now, you're trespassing on private property, and I'm asking you to leave. Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. How noble, Thomas. Standing by your purchased bride like a true romantic hero. But you can't change the facts with dramatic gestures. James had legitimate expectations regarding this ranch, expectations that survived his death. I'm simply ensuring those expectations are honored. James is dead, Thomas said bluntly. He died 23 years ago fighting for his country. Whatever expectations he might have had died with him. This ranch belongs to me according to my uncle's legally executed will, and no amount of convenient letters or corrupt legal maneuvering will change that. The accusation of corruption hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Judge Vale's face went pale with rage, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the valley road. A new group was approaching the ranch, this one flying the federal flag that indicated official territorial business. Rebecca felt hope surge in her chest as she recognized the lead rider. Federal Marshal William Davies was known throughout Colorado Territory as an honest lawman who couldn't be bought or intimidated. His presence suggested that word of Victoria's activities had reached ears in Denver that took a dim view of judicial corruption. Marshal Davies rode directly to the center of the confrontation, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind him rode two deputies and a man Rebecca didn't recognize, but whose expensive clothes and official bearing suggested significant authority. Judge Vale, Marshal Davies said, his voice carrying the flat authority of federal law. I understand you're conducting official business here. I trust you have proper documentation for any legal actions you're contemplating. The judge's confidence visibly wavered as he faced a law enforcement officer beyond his direct control. Marshal, this is a territorial matter involving property inheritance. I'm conducting a preliminary investigation into claims brought by Mrs. Caldwell regarding her late fiancé's rights to this ranch. The unknown man urged his horse forward. I'm Territorial Attorney General Marcus Stone, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of ultimate legal authority in Colorado Territory. I've been reviewing the documentation Mrs. Caldwell submitted to support her claims, and I have some questions about their authenticity. Victoria's face went white as she realized the scope of the opposition now arrayed against her. Attorney General Stone was not someone who could be influenced by local political connections or intimidated by armed men. His presence meant the territorial government was taking a direct interest in preventing judicial corruption. The letter from James Caldwell, Stone continued, shows some interesting inconsistencies when compared to authenticated samples of his handwriting in military records. The paper shows signs of artificial aging, and the ink composition is inconsistent with writing materials available during the time period it supposedly represents. The careful house of cards Victoria had constructed began to collapse around her. Her forged evidence had been exposed by experts who knew what to look for, and her husband's judicial authority meant nothing in the face of federal oversight. Judge Vale seemed to shrink in his saddle as the implications became clear. I was simply investigating claims brought to my attention by a concerned citizen. If the evidence proves unreliable, then naturally no legal action would be warranted.
On the contrary, Marshal Davies said, his voice carrying grim satisfaction. Attempting to use forged documents in legal proceedings constitutes fraud, regardless of whether the attempt succeeds. Mrs. Caldwell will need to answer questions about where she obtained these documents and who helped her create them. Victoria's composure finally cracked as she realized the trap she had set for Thomas had sprung on her instead. This is ridiculous. I'm simply trying to honor my late fiancé's wishes regarding property that should have been ours by right. Your late fiancé died before marrying you, Attorney General Stone replied coldly. He had no legal claim to property owned by his cousin, and consequently could not pass such a claim to you. Even if his letter were authentic, which it clearly is not, it would represent hopes rather than legal rights. The federal officials began the process of placing Victoria and her husband under arrest for fraud and conspiracy. The armed men they had brought found themselves facing federal deputies with clear legal authority and superior firepower. What had begun as an attempt to steal the Double Man Ranch through legal manipulation had become a disaster that would likely end in territorial prison for the conspirators. As the dust settled and the federal officers led their prisoners away, Rebecca found herself standing in the ranch yard with Thomas, watching justice prevail over greed and corruption. The threat that had loomed over their happiness was gone, removed by the very system of law and order that Victoria had tried to pervert for her own ends. Is it over? Rebecca asked, hardly daring to believe that the danger had passed so completely. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close as they watched the last of Victoria's men disappear down the valley road. It's over. The ranch is secure, our marriage is recognized, and we're free to build whatever future we choose. Emma emerged from the barn where Jake Morrison had kept her safely out of harm's way during the confrontation. She ran to them with the resilience of childhood, already ready to move past danger toward more interesting concerns. Mama, Mr. Thomas, can we have dinner now? All that shouting made me hungry, and Patches wants his evening oats. The simple request broke the tension that had gripped them all afternoon. Rebecca laughed, feeling giddy with relief and the sudden return of normalcy. They were safe, they were together, and life could continue on the path they had chosen for themselves. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table with Emma chattering about her adventures with Patches, Rebecca reflected on how much their lives had changed since that desperate night in the blizzard. What had begun as a marriage of pure convenience had become something precious and real, worth defending against any threat. Later, as they prepared for bed, Thomas took her hand gently. Rebecca, there's something I need to tell you. During all the drama today, I realized something important. I love you, not because of our arrangement, not because you're helping me keep the ranch, but because of who you are. You're brave and kind and strong, and I can't imagine my life without you anymore. The words she had hoped to hear sent warmth flooding through her chest. I love you too, Thomas. I think I started falling in love with you the night you bought Emma her horse. When I realized you weren't just providing for us out of obligation, but because you genuinely cared about our happiness. When he kissed her this time, it was with passion as well as tenderness, the kiss of a man claiming his beloved rather than sealing a business arrangement. Rebecca responded with equal fervor, finally free to express feelings that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Their wedding night had been delayed by months of careful courtship and building trust, but when it finally came, it was everything Rebecca could have hoped for. Thomas was gentle and patient, understanding that this represented not just the consummation of their marriage, but the beginning of a true partnership in every sense of the word. In the months that followed, the Double Man Ranch flourished under their joint management. Rebecca's organizational skills combined with Thomas's experience created an operation more efficient and profitable than either could have achieved alone. The ranch hands responded to her leadership with increasing respect, recognizing that she had earned her place through competence rather than simply marrying into it. Emma continued to thrive, growing tall and confident under the care of parents who loved her unconditionally. She became an accomplished rider under Thomas's patient instruction, and her quick mind absorbed lessons about ranch management that would serve her well in the future. The little girl who had once been pale and frightened was now healthy, happy, and secure in her place in the world. When Rebecca's pregnancy was confirmed in late summer, just weeks before the inheritance deadline, the joy on the ranch was universal. Emma was excited about becoming a big sister, the ranch hands celebrated the continuation of the Mitchell family line, and Thomas could barely contain his happiness at the prospect of a child with the woman he loved. The baby was born the following spring, a healthy son they named David after Thomas's father. Emma proved to be a devoted big sister, helping with the infant's care with the seriousness she brought to all her responsibilities. Thomas was a natural father, patient and loving with both children, while maintaining the strong leadership that kept the ranch running smoothly. As Rebecca sat on the porch one evening, watching Thomas teach Emma to rope while baby David slept peacefully in her arms, she marveled at the strange turns of fate that had brought them all together. The desperate woman who had accepted a stranger's proposal out of pure necessity was gone, replaced by someone who had found not just security but genuine happiness. The Double Man Ranch stretched out before them in the evening light, its rolling pastures dotted with healthy cattle and its buildings maintained with the pride that came from true ownership. This was their kingdom, built on love and mutual respect rather than convenience and desperation. Emma's laughter rang across the yard as she successfully roped a fence post, her triumph shared by the stepfather, who had become simply her father in every way that mattered. Thomas caught Rebecca's eye across the distance and smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face with joy and contentment. Their marriage had saved them all, but not in the way any of them had originally expected. What had begun as a transaction had become a love story. What had started as survival had become a life worth living. They had faced challenges and emerged stronger, had weathered storms and found shelter in each other. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca felt a deep satisfaction settle in her bones. They had built something precious here, something that would endure long after they were gone. The Double Man Ranch would pass to their children and their children's children, a legacy of love and determination that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. The practical rancher, who had needed an heir, and the desperate mother, who had needed a home, had found something neither had dared to hope for. They had found each other, and in doing so, had created a family that was stronger than the sum of its parts. In the end, that was the greatest inheritance of all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Double Man Ranch as Rebecca stood at her kitchen window, watching her family begin another day. 5 years had passed since that desperate winter night, when she and Emma had huddled on church steps, and the transformation in their lives still sometimes felt like a dream from which she might wake to find herself back in those dark circumstances. Thomas emerged from the barn, leading his favorite stallion, the same powerful animal that had carried him into town on the day their paths first crossed. At 40 now he moved with the confident stride of a man who had found his place in the world and was content with what he had built. The early morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, evidence of the years they had shared together and the responsibilities he carried as patriarch of their growing family. Emma, now 11, walked beside him carrying a bucket of oats for her beloved Patches. The frightened, sickly child, who had once clung to Rebecca's skirts, had grown into a confident young woman with her father's practical nature and her mother's sharp intelligence. She moved through the ranch with the easy competence of someone who had been raised to understand that every person had a role to play in the success of their community. In the nursery upstairs, baby David stirred in his crib, his soft murmurs carrying through the floorboards to where Rebecca worked. At 18 months, he was already showing signs of the Mitchell stubborn streak, determination evident in his chubby features as he tackled each new challenge with the single-minded focus of someone who refused to accept defeat. The inheritance crisis that had once threatened their future now seemed like a distant memory, resolved not just by his birth but by the solid foundation of love and commitment his parents had built together. The sound of approaching horses drew Rebecca's attention back to the present. A small group was riding up the valley road, their pace unhurried but purposeful. She recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Coleman, the honest lawman who had replaced the corrupt officials whose downfall had secured their ranch. Behind him rode two men she didn't immediately recognize, their Eastern clothing and careful posture marking them as visitors rather than locals. Thomas had noticed the approaching group as well, handing Patches as lead rope to Emma before walking toward the house. Rebecca met him on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron as she tried to read the intent in the visitor's approach. In their experience, unexpected official visits rarely brought good news, though they had done nothing that should attract unwanted attention from territorial authorities. Sheriff Coleman dismounted as the group reached the house, his weathered face breaking into the genuine smile he reserved for people he genuinely respected. "Morning, Thomas, Rebecca. Hope we're not interrupting anything important, but these gentlemen have traveled quite a distance to speak with you." The first of the unknown men stepped forward, removing his hat with the careful courtesy of someone accustomed to formal social interactions. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the soft hands and pale complexion of someone who worked primarily with papers rather than livestock. His expensive suit and precise manner suggested considerable education and social standing. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I'm attorney Harrison Webb from the territorial capital. This is my colleague, Dr. Marcus Thornton from the University of Denver. We've come regarding a matter that we believe will be of considerable interest to your family." Rebecca felt Thomas tense beside her, the automatic wariness that came from years of dealing with legal challenges and territorial politics. Their experience with Victoria Caldwell had taught them both to be suspicious of unexpected visits from officials, regardless of how legitimate they appeared on the surface. "What kind of matter?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Dr. Thornton stepped forward, his academic bearing evident in the way he organized his thoughts before speaking. "Mitchell, we've been conducting research into land grants and territorial development patterns. And your ranch has come to our attention for reasons that have nothing to do with legal challenges or inheritance disputes." The clarification provided some relief, but Rebecca remained cautious. Academic researchers could be just as disruptive to their peaceful life as corrupt judges, depending on what they had discovered and what they intended to do with their findings. "You see," Webb continued, "the territorial government has been working with federal authorities to identify properties that demonstrate exceptional stewardship and development success. The Double M Ranch has been cited repeatedly as an example of how intelligent management can transform marginal land into highly productive agricultural property." Emma had finished settling Patches and approached the group with the curiosity that characterized her approach to new situations. She stood slightly behind Thomas, but her attention was focused intently on the conversation, already understanding that whatever these men wanted would affect her family's future. Dr. Thornton smiled warmly at the girl before continuing his explanation. "Your ranch has become something of a case study in agricultural circles, Mrs. Mitchell. The crop rotation methods you've implemented, the water management systems you've developed, the integration of cattle and horse breeding programs have all attracted attention from universities and government agencies interested in promoting similar successes throughout the territory." Rebecca felt a flutter of pride at the recognition, though she remained puzzled about the purpose of their visit. The techniques she had learned on the Virginia plantation and adapted to Colorado conditions had indeed proven remarkably successful, but she had never considered them particularly innovative or worthy of academic study. "What exactly are you proposing?" Thomas asked, cutting through the compliments to reach the practical heart of the matter. Webb exchanged a glance with his colleague before responding. "The territorial government, in partnership with federal agricultural authorities, is establishing a new program to promote successful farming and ranching techniques throughout the Western Territories. They're looking for model properties to serve as demonstration sites and training centers for new settlers in struggling operations." The implications began to register in Rebecca's mind. They were being asked to transform their private ranch into some kind of public example, opening their home and their methods to scrutiny from strangers who might not understand the personal
investment and emotional commitment that made their success possible. We're not interested in turning our ranch into a public exhibition, Thomas said firmly. This is our home, our family's sanctuary. We've worked too hard to build our privacy and security to give it up for any government program. Dr. Thornton held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. Please, let us explain the full proposal before you make any decisions. This wouldn't involve opening your property to casual visitors or transforming your home into a public space. What we're suggesting is much more limited and controlled. Sheriff Coleman spoke up from where he had been listening quietly. Thomas, Rebecca, I've known these men for several months now, and I can vouch for their integrity. They're not here to disrupt your life or take advantage of what you've built. I think you should hear them out completely before deciding anything. The endorsement from someone they trusted carried considerable weight. Sheriff Coleman had proven his honesty and competence repeatedly since taking office, and his judgment had become something they relied upon in dealing with territorial politics and legal matters. All right, Rebecca said, gesturing toward the porch chairs. Why don't we sit down and you can explain exactly what you have in mind? As they settled into comfortable positions on the wide porch, baby David's cries drifted down from the nursery window. Rebecca excused herself briefly to attend to him, returning with the child in her arms. David immediately captured the attention of the visitors with his bright eyes and cheerful disposition, providing a softening influence that made the conversation feel more personal and less official. Webb began the detailed explanation of their proposal. The program we're developing would involve identifying perhaps a dozen properties throughout Colorado Territory that demonstrate exceptional success in different aspects of agricultural development. The Double Man Ranch would serve as the model for integrated livestock and crop management in mountain valley conditions. What would that mean in practical terms? Emma asked, speaking up with the directness that had become her trademark. Dr. Thornton smiled at her question. It would mean that perhaps twice a year, we would bring small groups of carefully selected individuals to tour your property and learn about your methods. These would be serious farmers and ranchers facing specific challenges, not casual tourists or government officials looking for entertainment. Rebecca found herself intrigued despite her initial reservations. The idea of helping other families avoid the struggles and near disasters she had experienced held considerable appeal. If their hard-won knowledge could prevent other children from facing the kind of desperation Emma had endured, perhaps the disruption would be worthwhile. How many people are we talking about? Thomas asked. And how much control would we have over who comes here and when? Groups of no more than 8 to 10 people, and only with your advance approval of the participants in scheduling, Webb replied. You would retain complete authority over your property and your participation. If at any point the arrangement becomes burdensome or inappropriate, you could withdraw from the program without penalty. The financial aspects of the proposal proved surprisingly generous. The territorial government would provide compensation for their time and expertise, along with funding for any improvements or demonstrations required for the educational program. More importantly, they would receive preferential treatment in government contracts for livestock and agricultural products, providing a reliable market for their ranch output. There's another aspect to this proposal that might interest you particularly, Mrs. Mitchell, Dr. Thornton said, addressing Rebecca directly. We'd like to document your agricultural methods and publish them as a guide for other ranch women facing similar challenges. Your innovations in crop rotation, food preservation, and household management in ranch conditions could help countless families throughout the territories. The suggestion sparked Emma's immediate interest. Mama, you could be famous. People everywhere would know about the things you've figured out to make our ranch work so well. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks at the idea of such public attention, but she also recognized the potential value of sharing knowledge that could genuinely help other families. The techniques she had developed through necessity and experimentation could indeed benefit women facing the isolation and challenges of frontier ranch life. Thomas studied her face carefully, reading the mixture of excitement and apprehension in her expression. What do you think, Rebecca? It's your knowledge they want to share, your methods they want to demonstrate. The decision should be primarily yours. The trust implicit in his statement touched her deeply. This man who had rescued her from desperation was now offering her the chance to help rescue others, and he was willing to open their private sanctuary to make that possible. The gesture spoke to the partnership they had built, the mutual respect that had grown from their practical arrangement into something far more meaningful. I think, Rebecca said slowly, that we have an obligation to help other people avoid the kind of desperate circumstances that brought me to your doorstep. If our experience can prevent other families from facing what Emma and I went through, then perhaps we should consider it. Emma clapped her hands together with excitement. And I could help. I know almost as much about the ranch as you and Papa do. I could show other children how to care for horses and help with the cattle. The enthusiasm in her daughter's voice helped solidify Rebecca's decision. Emma had thrived under the security and purpose of ranch life, and sharing that knowledge with other children could provide her with valuable experience while helping expand their own family's understanding of their methods and successes. Dr. Thornton reached into his satchel and withdrew a thick folder of documents. These are the preliminary agreements and program descriptions. Please take time to review them thoroughly, discuss them as a family, and let us know your decision within the next month. There's no pressure to participate, but we believe the program could benefit both your family and the broader agricultural community throughout the territories. As the visitors prepared to leave, Sheriff Coleman lingered on the porch for a private word with Thomas and Rebecca. I want you to know that I've investigated this program thoroughly, and it's completely legitimate. Dr. Thornton has an excellent reputation in academic circles, and Webb is known as one of the most honest attorneys in territorial government. If you decide to participate, you won't be taken advantage of. After the men had ridden away, Rebecca and Thomas spent the evening reviewing the documents and discussing the implications of the proposal. Emma contributed her own perspective with the practical wisdom that consistently surprised the adults around her, asking questions about logistics and long-term consequences that demonstrated her growing maturity. The money would be nice, Thomas observed, but that's not really the important consideration. We're doing well enough financially that we don't need government contracts to survive. The question is whether this opportunity aligns with our values and our goals for our family. Rebecca nodded, understanding the deeper implications of his statement. They had built their success through hard work, intelligent planning, and mutual support. Opening their home to outsiders could potentially compromise the privacy and security that had allowed them to flourish, but it could also extend their positive influence beyond the boundaries of their own property. I keep thinking about the families who might benefit, she said. Women who are struggling the way I was, children who are facing uncertainty and hardship. If our experience could help them find stability and success, don't we have a responsibility to share what we've learned? Emma looked up from the book she had been pretending to read while listening to the adult conversation. Mama, remember when we first came here, and Mrs. Patterson helped us even though she didn't know anything about us? Maybe this is our chance to be like her for other people. The observation crystallized Rebecca's feelings about the proposal. They had been the beneficiaries of kindness from strangers, from Thomas's willingness to help a desperate woman to the ranch hand's acceptance of an unknown family. Perhaps it was time for them to extend similar kindness to others facing comparable challenges. Over the following weeks, they discussed the proposal with key members of their ranch community. Jake Morrison and the other hands expressed enthusiasm for the idea, seeing it as recognition of their collective success and an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of their methods. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become like family over the years, offered to help with the additional hosting responsibilities that would come with visiting groups. The deciding factor came from an unexpected source. Pastor Wright, now elderly but still sharp in his observations about human nature, visited the ranch specifically to discuss the proposal with them. He had heard about the opportunity through his connections with territorial officials and wanted to offer his perspective on the moral implications of their decision. I've watched your family grow and flourish over these years, he told them as they sat on the porch after Sunday dinner. You've built something precious here, something that demonstrates the best of what human beings can accomplish when they work together with love and mutual respect. The question is whether you're called to keep that blessing to yourselves or share it with others who might benefit from your example. Rebecca found his words echoing thoughts that had been growing in her mind since the initial proposal. Their success felt like a gift that had been given to them through the combination of their own efforts and circumstances beyond their control. Thomas's willingness to help a stranger, the honest officials who had protected them from corruption, the community of ranch hands who had accepted and supported them, all had contributed to creating something larger than any individual achievement. What do you think we should do, Pastor? Emma asked with the directness that characterized her approach to important questions. Pastor Wright smiled at the girl who had grown from a frightened child into a confident young woman under his observation. I think you should ask yourselves what kind of legacy you want to leave. Do you want to be remembered as a family that built something beautiful and kept it to themselves, or as people who used their success to help others achieve similar happiness? That evening, as they gathered around the dinner table for their family discussion, the decision felt inevitable. They would participate in the program, but with carefully defined boundaries and clear expectations about their continued privacy and autonomy. The Double Man Ranch would become a model for agricultural success, but it would remain first and foremost their family home. The first group of visiting farmers arrived in late summer, 8 men and 2 women from struggling operations throughout Colorado Territory. Rebecca had spent weeks preparing for their visit, organizing demonstrations and preparing educational materials that would help them understand not just what the ranch did, but why those methods worked in their specific environment. Emma proved to be a natural teacher, explaining complex concepts in simple terms while demonstrating practical techniques with the confidence of someone who had grown up applying them daily. The visitors were impressed, not just by her knowledge but by her obvious happiness and security, evidence that the ranch's success translated into genuine family well-being. Thomas guided the group through the livestock operations, explaining breeding programs and pasture management while emphasizing the importance of patience and long-term planning in building sustainable success. His practical approach and obvious expertise earned the immediate respect of farmers who had struggled with similar challenges on their own properties. But it was Rebecca's session on household management and food systems that generated the most enthusiasm among the visitors. Her methods for preserving meat and vegetables, managing limited resources, and maintaining family morale during difficult periods addressed challenges that every ranch family faced but rarely discussed openly. Mrs. Mitchell, one of the visiting women, said during the final evening of their stay, "What you've shared with us could change everything for my family. I've been struggling to make our ranch work for 3 years, feeling like I was failing at everything. Seeing what you've accomplished and learning your methods gives me hope that we can succeed too." The gratitude in her voice reminded Rebecca of her own desperate circumstances just years before. This woman was facing the same fears and challenges that had once driven Rebecca to accept marriage to a stranger, and now she could offer practical solutions that might prevent such desperation from overwhelming another family. As the years passed, the Double Man Ranch's reputation as a center of agricultural innovation continued to grow. The educational program brought a steady stream of visitors who learned not just technical methods, but the importance of family cooperation and long-term commitment in building lasting success. Many returned to their own properties with renewed confidence and practical knowledge that transformed their operations. Emma grew into her role as a teacher and demonstrator, her natural leadership abilities and deep knowledge making her invaluable to the program's success. At 16, she was already being consulted by territorial agricultural authorities about policies and programs designed to support struggling ranchers throughout the region. David, now 6 years old, had grown up surrounded by visitors and demonstrations, making him remarkably confident and articulate for his age. He absorbed lessons about ranching and farming with the same ease that other children learned to read, and his quick questions often sparked insights that benefited even experienced visitors. The financial rewards of their participation in the program had allowed them to expand their operations significantly while maintaining the sustainable practices that had made them successful in the first place. The Double Man Ranch now ran over 1,000 head of cattle across expanded pastures, while their horse breeding program had gained recognition throughout the Western Territories. But perhaps more importantly, they had created a legacy that extended far beyond their own property. Former visitors regularly wrote to share news of their successes, often crediting techniques learned at the Double Man Ranch with transforming their operations and securing their families' futures. Rebecca kept every letter, treasuring them as evidence that their willingness to share their knowledge was genuinely making a difference in people's lives. One evening in early autumn, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate woman who had accepted a stranger's proposal out of pure necessity seemed like someone from a different lifetime.
though she could still remember clearly the fear and uncertainty that had driven those desperate choices. "Do you ever regret agreeing to the program?" Thomas asked, following her gaze across the valley, where their cattle grazed peacefully in the evening light. Rebecca considered the question seriously, thinking about the privacy they had sacrificed and the additional responsibilities they had assumed. "No," she said finally. "I think sharing what we've learned has made our success more meaningful, not less. We've built something here that's bigger than just our own happiness." Emma looked up from the book she was reading in the fading light. "Mama, Mrs. Henderson wrote that her family's ranch is finally making money using the crop rotation you taught her. She said her children are healthy and happy for the first time since they moved to Colorado." The simple statement encapsulated everything Rebecca had hoped to achieve through their participation in the program. Somewhere across the territory, children who might have faced the kind of desperate circumstances Emma had endured were instead growing up secure and confident because their parents had learned techniques that made their ranch sustainable and profitable. Thomas reached over to take Rebecca's hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of years spent building a life together. "You know what I think," he said. "I think we got exactly what we needed when we made our original bargain, but we ended up with far more than either of us dared to hope for." Baby David stirred in Rebecca's arms, his sleepy murmur reminding them that their family continued to grow and thrive. The inheritance crisis that had once threatened their future now seemed like ancient history, resolved not just by his birth, but by the strong foundation of love and mutual respect his parents had built together. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rebecca felt a deep contentment settle in her bones. They had built something precious here, something that would endure long after they were gone. The double-man ranch would pass to their children and their children's children. But more than that, the knowledge and techniques they had developed would continue to help families throughout the territories build their own versions of success and happiness. The practical rancher who had needed an heir and the desperate mother who had needed a home had found something neither had dared to hope for. They had found each other, and in doing so, had created not just a family but a legacy that extended far beyond the boundaries of their own property. In the end, that was the greatest inheritance of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.